Yeah, that's
So
why I'm skeptical of the term self-organization. I think it's overused. And
yes,
instead of auto-poiesis, which is Greek for
yes,
self-organization, I use the term tribopoiesis. And
that's
what
good.
tribopoiesis does, it refers to as human being tribal rather than individual creatures. And then we can look at everything, all sort of complex systems, like why wouldn't the system work in such a way that the system as a whole would benefit from a survival perspective? Of
Hmm.
course it would. So your body would then try to prolong its own existence for as long as it possibly could before it finally falls apart, because tribal poetically, the tribe itself is not served by eternal life. So Mixel wasn't born Mixel, we don't care. Mixel is Mixel today. Mixel, why don't you tell us about who you are? Because you and I met on the intellectual deep web and got deeply fascinated with one another. We should start
Hmm.
there. So
Yes.
I'm Alexander. I'm in Sweden right now. You're Mixel. Right now you're in Belgium. So why don't you start by telling people who you are and what you're up to?
My research started in artificial intelligence, trying to figure out a higher level of cognition. So I was doing artificial life simulations as an engineer, because that's the thing I like to do. I'm an engineer. But we were looking at creativity. And out of it came something, but it's kind of a more like an antithesis than really something we could keep working on in machine learning. So I decided to switch from artificial intelligence, where we create the algorithm, but the interactions are free, the agents are free, to work with real people and focus on platforms where we can actually define the rules of the game and see how we can have collective intelligence emerging. I've done a PhD in an institute we created called the Global Brain Institute. And it's the whole idea of how is deep digital the origin of life. That's a little bit my focus I'm working on. And I validated my PhD as an engineer by creating a peer-learned platform where I demonstrated that a person that can normally supervise 30 projects could supervise 300 projects. So it's a whole structure demonstrating the collective intelligence. That's until 4 years ago. 4 years ago, it switched to way deeper. It went deep into psychology. And now I'm more focused on mass psychology. I have a very different worldview. I don't really see people aligning with that worldview yet, but it's like meta science. I don't want to go into metaphysics because that term is pretty well defined, but it's a little bit about understanding how more of the metaphysics can dissolve paradoxes by understanding how we can start integrating concept of meta systems in our reality. So things I've been playing.
There was a lot of meta-flation there.
Okay.
Which I'm allergic to, but
Okay.
of course I use the prefix meta too. Sometimes use the prefix trans, sometimes sub. There are different prefixes we use when we put terminology in here. And by the way, I should just add that what you just described is something Daniel Schmachtenberg and I agreed on 2 years ago to call symbiotic intelligence. It's just the optimization of intelligence, regardless of whether people or machines are involved, or it's some kind of collaboration of people and machines, which it, of course, often is today. So symbiotic intelligence, or SI, could be a good term there. But when you started using that, metaphysics, we know what that is. Metaphysics is always, for human beings, the ultimate narrative about ourselves. So the ultimate possible narrative we can have about ourselves, scientifically or theatrically, or symbolically, imaginary, whatever. But all the narratives about ourselves, metaphysics. This is why physics is contained within metaphysics. Metaphysics is always the larger zone, right?
Yes.
So that's what meta should be. So when you say meta science, isn't that actually traditional what philosophy science was supposed to be? Or what do you mean with meta science? And when you say meta systems,
focus on
in what way is there a system for systems?
Okay. Well, that's pretty easy. It's defined in cybernetics. So if you it's the idea that first there's interaction, then if interaction keeps on going, the most fit system will go into a coordination. And if that coordination keeps on becoming useful, it goes into a control. But control is a bit bad word to describe what really goes on, because we are like a multicellular structure, but every cell is basically self-organizing. So there is like a meta control, because of course there are some interactions. If I don't feed my body will start eating my muscles to keep my brains alive. So there is kind of not fully self-organization, but there is like an aggregation and mediation across a collective.
Yeah, that's why I'm skeptical of the term self-organization. I think it's overused.
Yes.
And instead of auto-poiesis, which is Greek for
Yes.
self-organization, I use the term tribopoiesis. And
That's
what
good.
tribopoiesis does, it refers to as human being tribal rather than individual creatures. And then we can look at everything, all sort of complex systems, like why wouldn't the system work in such a way the system as a whole would benefit from a survival perspective? Of course it would. So your body would then try to prolong its own existence for as long as it possibly could before it finally falls apart, because tribopoetically, the tribe itself is not served by eternal life. For example, it's too costly to begin with. So it's served by actually certain bodies obtaining and then keeping the tribe alive for a certain generation before it's passed on to the next generation. And this is why we can look at these sort of complex systems. Like, it's not about the system itself surviving for as long as possible. It's about surviving at a certain cost. And that cost can be referred to as being tribopoetical. So what actually in an evolutionary sense survives at all times, regardless of which systems you look at, is the tribopoetical aspect of the system. This is precisely why there has to be a collaboration between your brain and your muscles, and usually your dick or your pussy too, if you're honest about it. True. So they have to collaborate for the body to optimize its specific archetypal role within a larger system that we call the tribe.
Well, and I'm, as an applied scientist, I'm trying to touch that. So the things I'm doing is mostly, so that's also why I call myself like a digital shaman. Because what I'm doing is understanding how digital cultures self-organize. But I do really see a strong link with the shamanic tradition, because I actually already also got that kind of education. But
hey, we're two.
Yeah. The thing is, actually, it started without any substance use. It started purely from doing research on this, what I like to call, so I was focusing on collective intelligence, trying to really understand the emerging of consciousness in the meta system, right? You see people interacting, you see people coordinating in teams, you see people creating organizations, but our organizations are, if you would call them alive, they're like the most primitive version of living that you can imagine. So they are stupid, basically. So they are not like the complex life we know. So what I'm trying to figure out
I would even argue and say that what we increasingly start to call technological life now, we know for certain that it's all about discrete units and zeros and ones in different aspects. So that is stupid in the sense that it doesn't have, for example, the pathic energy that human beings have and animals have. So, the sort of emotions, feelings, whatever that we operate with, and they constantly interfere with our logic, sense of logic. Sure. These machines operate on a strictly logical level, strictly logical level, but they do so with speed and with efficiency and with storage space that beats the shit out of human beings. So it's not degrading to say technological life or say that it's more primitive or anything like that at all, but rather it's just a different category of life. I think we can embrace the idea that technological life is different from animal life or plant life or human life. But
it's about organizations, not just about technology, right? So if I look at a company, an organization, the organization is not as refined as a person in the way it can react with the world. The smaller the organization, like if you have small startups, they can be way more intelligent than large scale organizations that seem to, they react very slow. It's more like an elephant. And so
which is why I mentioned speed here.
Yes,
so
yes.
And the fun thing to do when you work on machines, which both you and I love to do, is that the machines are really fast in a way the human beings are not. So obviously, just check a regular search algorithm of Google and you can find, the restaurant you're looking for when you go out at night, despite looking through the entire globe within a microsecond. the speed of the operations here is what's actually is key. So we define intelligence in a very, very wide sense. It's not just the capacity for calculation or anything like that, or the capacity for calculating a self-interest or whatever you want to call it. It is much more complex than that. So actually, I would say intelligence today, as we use it, is an abstract.
Yeah, okay.
It's an abstract philosophical term we're using here. It's not clearly defined, and there's a reason why it isn't. So I'm back to meta systems though. Why do you use that term at all?
Because so I'm looking at how things that start from interacting, how they improve by going to coordination, and how that coordination will actually end up into a meta system. And
why a meta system? Why not just a system?
Because there is this fixed point that happened. And until now, I only thought of it as a purely logical thing. But like 4 years ago, I understood that that's actually what psychology is about as well. You create like okay, let me go a little bit. I want to jump into something you say in some of your TED Talks where you put God not in the back, but in the future. Yeah. And I was thinking about, that's a nice one. And now let's create recursion. Because if the God in the future is a God in the past, you actually got like this loops thing happening. And what I've noticed that what I love about the software training is we really learn well how to think in terms of recursion. And by working really well in terms of recursion, we start shifting from being able to handle a complicated world to handling a complex world where there's all these feedback things amplifying and perturbating. And
this, we should say, is what you and I call cybernetics fundamentally. Cybernetics deals with that, yes.
Yes.
So it's basically the science of feedback loops, and it started in the 20th century. It's one of the great revolutions of the 20th century, yeah.
Yes, and it's still ongoing. I mean, we started with the pretty simple systems and cybernetics, and now we moved on to complex adaptive systems and evolutionary cybernetics. And this evolutionary cybernetics is popping up in domains that don't really want to touch the concept cybernetics, which is kind of very strange. I mean, I'm coming from a domain where we look at thermodynamics, we look at auto-poietic systems, what you mentioned, but I don't know if you know the things like the Brusselator. It's work from Prigogine. That's, for me, is a very important. I mean, I look at convection cells and I see the origin of cells in physics. It's purely flow dynamic. But if you then start talking to people in the quantum realm, in the elementary physics, who are today actually touching on many of those concepts, they don't seem to know those domains because it's from outside their school of thought. Mm-hmm. So I have a problem trying to actually, I mean, like a few days ago, we had the talk again with Don Hoffman, who actually has this evolutionary game theory as a reason against reality. So he gets very close to that principle, but somehow he doesn't know anything about that other domain that's out there and that has so many concrete examples of how it's working. And
yeah, so he's missing out what I call pathical narrative. He stays with a logical narrative realm and doesn't understand pathical narrative and how actually that interferes with logical all the time. I just call this the constant Western problem of Platonism. Mm. And if, for example, work as an advisor in Silicon Valley, like I have many years, then you discover that the problem in Silicon Valley is that it's full of young boys who are Platonists.
Oh.
That's why they want to upload, although anybody who's thought through uploading properly would realize it would be the ultimate horror.
Okay, I got to tell you this.
And that's also why they want to go to Mars. And everybody with a brain, knows that we're not going to go to Mars. If AI is going to do one thing when AI piggybacks on human beings, is that AI will certainly colonize space and leave us on this planet to take care of ourselves, because the human body simply is not and will not be fit for life in outer space for eons to come. It's just that it's too costly tribopoietically to readjust the human body to live in space. It's just a boyish little dream for boys who haven't grown up and become proper men and who want to, instead of saving the planet, they want to go to another planet, which is just like escaping the actual problem. Yeah,
they're trying to make the god Mars alive, and the god Mars is about the god of war, right? So, but for me, it's also the
boy soldiers, that's what they
exactly.
are. Right?
It's we go from, I like this. I don't know if this resonates with you, but I have this saying: we are going from mental to metal. So we are losing our minds using social media to actually create the next life form, which will be embodied in a metal way.
Well,
that's what we are
I
doing.
tell you what, the new book I'm writing with Jan Söderqvist, our big work coming out in 2022 called Process and Event, is basically a rewriting of history, celebrating the Bronze Age and really putting down hard on the Axial Age.
I like that.
We are celebrating engineers. Yes, we're celebrating people who do shit and build stuff rather than people who talk about it all the time and have all kinds of vain ideas about themselves. So it's putting an end to Western narcissism radically.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, the thing is that what triggered me just before, it's when you said like the Silicon Valley boys, they keep on playing, the boys keep on playing with toys. I was 8 years ago, I was in Hebei, that's the province around Beijing. And we were there with a whole delegate of engineers from the Netherlands who were focused on food. All things about related to food. But the reason I was asked with this this group is because they wanted to actually figure out if they can do a bigger project, create a total solution for food safety. So try imagine why we wanted to have a big project on food safety 8 years ago. Should I tell you more? No? Okay. I'm gonna leave it between the lines. But the thing that was interesting is that I here trying to explain the concept of platforms for collective intelligence, and it's very, very hard even for the people who are into systems and cybernetics, even people who are into poetic structures and know all that kind of stuff. And still it's very hard for me to explain it to them from an engineering point, like what I'm doing.
This has to be, I agree.
But the thing is that
there's a big gap there. And like Ilya Prigogine also read, he was Belgian, wasn't he? Although they have kind of a Russian name, but he was Belgian, right? So Ilya Prigogine was one of those guys you read who were really pioneers in this area that we called system theory. Sometimes today it's called complexity theory, right?
Yeah.
I don't use the word metasystem. I haven't been convinced yet that I should use it. I'm rather skeptical about that there are any metasystems in any sort of formal sense. But
that's going to be.
But there are systems, and systems compete for survival, hopefully. And if they don't, then probably they just vanish anyway, won't they? So I'm interested in system theory in that sense. But you're absolutely right. There's a big gap between people who get one half of this and can understand, for example, what we mean when we say pathical narrative is lacking. Whereas they're going back to, but we're sitting here with the computers and we got the zeros and ones. And it's just like, well, you know, if you really dig deep into the world of philosophy and into metaphysics, you also discover that when you do physics, you can't just settle with the zeros and ones eventually. Sure. Because physics itself is built on something we today start to call subphysics. And that's exactly what there are problems, for example, to unite quantum mechanics with relativity theory. The problems that physics are trying to overcome actually require that we split physics the way we once split physics and biology. Yeah. Because physics and subphysics operate in different ways. We wouldn't even recognize that subphysics has any sort of existence that we can experience in any meaningful way. Because subphysics is a world of what Gilles Deleuze used to call pure potentials. Yeah, but it actually is required. You can't do, like Alfred North Whitehead was the fantastic British mathematician and philosopher who predated the quantum mechanical revolution. He basically set the framework for quantum mechanics, or quantum physics to even be thought, right? He did that in the 1920s. His book, Process and Reality, came out in 1929. And about 6 years later, Niels Bohr formulated the first attempt at understanding quantum physics, which we now call the Copenhagen interpretation.
Yeah, so, which everyone still agreed that it's a bad idea, but okay.
Even the people that agree. Copenhagen interpretation does not make sense, and actually, it's just as good as the science could be until a certain point where I actually think we're getting around it.
But the thing is that I'm as an engineer, I have a problem with that because I'm really just trying to get grounded. And the things I saw.
No, the question is, what do you want to get grounded in? As an engineer, say you want to build a skyscraper. Now, anybody studied engineering from a distance like I have, well, you are an engineer, and I admire you for that. So, you know, the thing here is that I know that an engineer will spend 20 years on building the foundation of the skyscraper, and then probably, 2 weeks to build the top. right?
Sure.
It's kind of, you want to go to foundation. So the ground you talk about when you say the ground for engineers is one is simply just functional. And that's exactly what the Copeland interpretation was attractive to people who took an engineering perspective before they walked into the physics labs, which is fine. They did achieve amazing work for the next 50 years because that was the ground they could work from. Only then did the whole thing start to crack when you started to have the ambition towards, for example, quantum gravity.
Yeah, but wait a minute, because
if you're going to unite different physics theories, it turns out maybe you can't unite physics itself. You have to start discussing physics as two different domains, the way you actually separate physics and biology.
Yeah, we are going in a direction that's not my domain, I feel. So I just wanted to let you know that I'm feeling you.
No, but emergence theory certainly is your domain, because you're talking about emergences all the time. This was my point.
Culture.
That's what I wanted to write. And that's what I do as philosopher today. I discuss what can we possibly say about an emergence, or is there even a general emergence theory? And I arrived at the conclusion that it's impossible to dictate general emergence theory, because a general emergence theory, like these are the general qualifications for something called an emergence to happen along the time axis. If there are general qualifications for emergences prior to them happening, you just put the creator God back into the creation once again. And that's what we want to avoid at all times.
Sure, but the thing is
self-creating.
I fully agree.
You cannot dictate requirements for anything prior to its happening. And that's exactly why we need to go back to damn Hegel, because this is exactly what Hegel said 200 years ago, when Hegel said, contingency is the rule of the game when you look forward, and necessity is always something we construct in hindsight.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
Yeah. So you have to build emergence theory on that. I don't know if you agree
emerging,
with that.
that's the thing that I'm following you there with the emerging and with I like the word you used earlier, the tribal emergence.
Tribopoiesis.
Take
auto-poiesis, just take out and put tribal in. So,
well, I like that.
It's a Greek word for the origin of anything that happens is a tribal structure. So the origin of something is a tribal interest rather than a self-interest. I want to get the self out of the way.
I think that I love that word, and I'm going to dig into a bit deeper, because I have the feeling that that's the thing I'm resonating with all the time. Now, I need to be careful as someone who is just putting his hand in the dirt. I'm all the time just playing with clay. I don't always know the labels that they put on the clay, right? So I know that I've had quite some interesting talks with philosophers.
Yeah, you and I are talking about different disciplines that have different vocabularies. We try to unify them. For example, part of my work today, I'm really well schooled in the tradition, philosophical tradition, both East and West. The problem is that I encounter a lot of computer scientists today that are very, very clever. One of them is Forrest Landry, who I've done a couple of webcasts with. He lives in California. He's a former computer scientist who's smart enough to even think Hegelian thoughts without ever having read Hegel, but he doesn't know that. So he uses a brand new vocabulary that to philosophy, the world of philosophy, like, oh God, yes, now we're going to have the Tower of Babel in metaphysics, because we're going to have different disciplines trying to, and you're exactly in between these two of these disciplines that find it very hard to communicate one another. And that's what I call the pathical and logical narrative when we encounter, for example, system theory.
Okay.
So Forrest Landry, for example, is great. I guarantee you he hasn't read Ilya Prigogine. Okay. But he's like a child of Ilya Prigogine, because
but it's crazy,
his favorite computer scientist is obviously studied Prigogine before. So there has to be a sort of a reconnection to understand the full scope of these discoveries.
Yeah, I think over there you really have like the solution to a huge problem, because it's always like this chicken egg problem, right? What came first? What came second? And I think that with the concepts like dissipative systems, you see how it emerges out of a field. And
you have to explain what dissipative systems is.
So a dissipative
system, just lost 9 out of 10 listeners right there.
Okay,
so explain what that is. Yeah.
So think about a whirlpool. A whirlpool is a dissipative system. So you have a fluid. You start pushing that fluid in what we call far from equilibrium. So think about, like, I think the convection cells, those is a situation that happened just before boiling. So what you do is you heat the water so much that all these particles start interacting like crazy, right? But they don't yet are capable of escaping the boundary. So what they start trying to do then is like coordinate. And so what happens is that they will take the heat from the bottom, they will push it on one side to the top, and then they will give off the heat at the top, and then they go back down. But this is basically a metabolism turned inside out. This is a metabolism of a fluid before the fluid has any kind of embodiment, because they are transporting the heat by coordinating as pure molecules. But if you look at it, it's like all kind of cells just emerge suddenly, and they look like cells, but they are just fluids. So suddenly you see things like a copy mechanism. That's what we always looking for, inheritance. You see metabolism. That's what we are all the time looking for in the origin of life. But it's over there in fluid dynamic, and it's as easy as a pie. And the guy got a Nobel Prize for it in 1977. But the thing is, it was in chemistry. Well, the thing is, he's working on thermodynamics. It's both in chemistry and in physics. But somehow all the people of physics don't just like, no, that's chemistry. We're not looking at it. It's like, what the hell? And I've got that kind of feeling all the time. I mean, I would love to get back to what you just said about Silicon Valley boys and the experience I had, because that's what I'm really talking about. Real experience in the real world, giving us feedback and forcing us to change our minds. That's what I love, right? So what happened is I've demonstrated a peer-learned platform here in Brussels, showing that was in the Solvay Business School. So that's where I did it. And I demonstrated showing how it worked with 300 projects. And then I had the ability, so the reason that the people of the farming engineers wanted me to collaborate is because the platform I have could be the glue for what they wanted to do. They had a huge complex interaction problem, and they wanted to use my peer-learn platform to actually supervise all the different research departments in crossing those knowledge. So it was, so that platform could have been used for them to do to make science go digital. That's something I'm have with the concept of the Interversity. But when I describe this thing to like top diplomats in the province of Hebei, so in China, I was surprised how easily they start playing with that. First of all, they asked really good questions to my research, but like half an hour in the discussion, I start asking questions about my research to them. And that kind of, it's something later on I really started wondering what just happened here. And I think what happened is they started with a culture of thinking collectively, and they moved to the need to start working on collective intelligence. So the move from thinking collectively to collective intelligence is a very intuitive step. While if I look at the West, where my in Brussels, the problem is that we start from individual intelligence and shifting from
atomized intelligence, which you call atomized,
yeah, atomized, and moving to collective intelligence, that's counterintuitive. So our culture is like not allowing us to understand it. If I tell people like, you know what, if we all drive slower on the highway, we would all get faster to our destination. For a lot of people, that just doesn't align. They're not going to say like, why should we collectively go slower? I want to be there faster, so I should move faster. But they don't know those feedback dynamics. Like, you know, the game they play with people running in a circle, and first they ask them to keep a certain speed, and then everything flows nicely. But then they say, go as fast as you can. And then you get all the times those waves, like everyone is running very fast to stand in a line. It's like, it's very crazy.
It's like every time you deal with humans, you have a certain complexity level and you get that, oh, all people can understand this, right? Then you move to the next complexity level and you realize the cost to move to a new level is actually that 90% of people will drop out.
Yes.
And the worst ones are the ones that pretend they understood you just did that, but don't understand what you did. They're even worse because you still need to get rid of them, but actively, right? The other ones just drop out. And then the third level occurs and you realize I'm going to have to drop off another 90% and hopefully keep another 10% on this level. And they might as well by then have a strong tribal or self-interest to defend why they would take that move with me. That's how difficult it is to actually to go into really complex studies of anything.
You can examine that. That's funny.
simple realm, or in a realm that is pure mimicking. It's just like, we've done this before, let's do it over again the same way. And this, of course, the problem with very big, large, complex societies like the current one, that it is really hard to be radical with any idea, try out any idea, unless you get resources from somewhere, find a few friends that you handpick, and you go into a lab environment where you can do things. That's, for example, how the entire tech startup world operates. And why it is so efficient is that it actually operates like, just pick the people you really need to develop the idea briefly at the smallest possible cost, because that's all it takes to beat large institutions who are just nothing but conservative environments trying to survive by keeping things as they always were. They move into status quo very, very quickly.
So, and even if you don't have any resources, you can still kind of hack your way into it.
Yeah,
I don't have any resources at all. But
you and I are members, for example, of the Intellectual Deep Web. We're probably members of several other networks, both of us, without knowing it, but that's when we definitely met. And the reason why you join these networks is that it does pay off in your mailbox every day to have a few emails from a network like that consists of philosophers and artists from 4 different continents in the English language who just love to share ideas with one another on a free basis, and are really generous with crediting one another when they co-develop ideas. And that's all it takes. And because it is transdisciplinary, truly so, it's certainly both philosophy and art to begin with. It's also, there's a lot of lifestyle thrown into it. Like, I don't think anybody has a problem with sleeping around or taking drugs in this environment, but it's a different story. It is simply a very open-minded culture. And that's why you can joke about the world outside. But that's probably because it's a culture that, if it only takes 3 levels of complexity to reach the level you can participate in the discourse in a forum like that, you have already moved beyond the first and the second one, where things like television and radio and mass media are stuck now. Because they cannot go into that sort of 3rd layer of complexity that, for example, a sophisticated online forum requires of you.
But so if I go back to my my research, so what I've been trying to do there is actually understand how that changes. So understand how there's like a transition from one phase to another. So I see an emerging online community that has something to give. I'll be very concrete. In between 2004 and 2000 and what was it, 8, there was this battle of the content management systems. You could see that online suddenly there were many of these content management systems coming up. So I start digging into deeper, understanding like, okay, which projects are running, why are they running, how are they running, and figure out like what is in there. Like today, WordPress, for example, is the big winner out of this game. But what I've found locally is I didn't really see a lot about cultural aspects. While there was this other, the underdog of the game was Drupal. But there was a very interesting culture happening because people were singing songs, baking cakes, knitting socks for something as dull as a website builder. Why the hell would anyone start doing that? Like create like rock and roll for a website builder? That was strange. So dive into that. And you see that grow exponential, so that suddenly like in 2011, we were big enough to just rent the Hilton in Chicago for an event. But you can start playing if you kind of have that kind of numbers, 3,000 people. So I've started playing there without really anyone really knowing. So it was like playing as an underdog, right? As a hacker. But I was playing with the concept of a hive mind, understanding how that worked. And I'm going to give you a very simple example because you really see like the brain coming back at the level of 3,000 people. So what we did is a very specific case where you have like this left brain, right brain activity with 3,000 people. And so it's an advanced experiment on extended minds. And so, but for the people involved, it was just a very pragmatic thing to improve the experience. So it's improving the experience of a keynote. How do you do that? Before you start, you have a tech, so you have a tech public. So you know that all of them are on Twitter and that kind of stuff. So what you say is like, people, we are with 3,000 people, we cannot ask questions in the end. That's impossible, right? So, but what we will do is here's a very specific hashtag, like this long, right? And if you have any ideas while the keynote is going on, just put them there. And it will be like a parallel thread of thought. But if you are in it, like you see a very good keynote that's sucking you in like a movie, right? It's sucking you in the experience and the presence of the keynote. But at the same time, you have the thread of thoughts that you didn't create. You didn't create energy to have that kind of thoughts.
No, I think we got it all from hyperlinking when we realized that hyperlinking would be every word in our language. That's why, for example, when Jan and I started writing over 20 years ago, we don't have footnotes in our books.
But we
take it for granted that every word in our books is a footnote in itself. You can just press that word and find the entire history of how that word is being used, if you like. And if there's a great idea we should have in the book, it should be directly in the text. So it's just that footnotes became redundant once hyperlinking became this idea. And you can, of course, then create these huge networks of things. And you can then go into the special silos when you really want to study something because it's there and it's available for you. And that's why hashtags are the same, but like hyperlinks, they're a great way for people to do that.
To finish it, right? What you had when you do that in this kind of room is that after 15 minutes or 20 minutes, you really have the feeling that you are the room, that you are those 3,000 people. So you get into this meta position of your consciousness. You have your own consciousness still being there, but you have at the same time, you have this hive mind kind of feeling of being the room.
Yeah, that's why I love Burning Man. And why I love burner culture, because burner culture is the same thing, but it's more bodily. So the hive mind you talk about that becomes a hive body. And the hive body is a burn. You go there and you stay in your camp or your free camp and walk around and you flow freely 24 hours a day between the different camps, the different themes, day and night. You co-create everything. So everything is co-created. No money's allowed anywhere, meaning you got to take everything what you need. You got to be self-responsible, meaning also other people don't have to be responsible for you. So they can concentrate on their different projects. But what you do is that you instantly create hives. They're called camps. And the different camps then have different funny themes, usually an ironic twist on the outside world. I mean, I go to the borderland every year in Scandinavia, and our camp is called Queer Klux Klan. It's an obvious name for a burn, isn't it? Sure. You know, anybody who says humor gets it right away. And those who don't get it shouldn't go to a burn to begin with. So somebody said it's the best camp name they ever heard besides Barbie Death Camp at Burning Man.
Okay, that's awesome.
Barbie Death Camp is Auschwitz full of Barbie dolls. So there you go.
Ooh.
If you can't joke about it, you know, you can't joke about everything. That's a sign of intelligence, right? Great. So yeah, so burner culture is very similar to that. It's just even more bodily in its experience. But the thing with Burning Man is that people use the online world massively to go to these events, but prefer to use the online world prior to and after the event. Just like if it's like you take a psychedelic trip, there's always 3 moments you're involved with. The first one is the intention. The second one is taking the drug itself, the ceremony, and the third one is the integration. And the more you experience these things, the less important the ceremony is in itself. So if you go to Burning Man these days, yeah, you will have fun for 8 days. But listen, if you don't come well prepared, meaning you've been online tons before you go there, and if you don't follow up with the community and keep seeing the new friends for life and partners for life or whatever that you met, your new collaborators that you start your new company with, they all come out of the burner culture. So this essentially becomes a very complete lifestyle that makes perfect sense. It's dead fun, real deep, and perfect for the new digital age.
I would actually like to experience it. I haven't yet.
Because I've been to Hackers Conference and I love them as well. I was at the HCPP in Prague last year. Prague being the center of hackers in Europe.
Yeah,
fantastic center, by the way. But the great thing with the hackers community is that I can definitely see how it will overlap with the burner community more and more and more, and they will actually relate to one another.
Yeah, I can see the emerging coming up to it all. That's
just like if you were into drugs in the past, you would have a lot of black and gay friends until the black and gay friends became politically active and then became woke people and stopped dealing with drugs and were no fun any longer because they were political. Just like grab a new movement by its balls when you see it, because it will go increasingly pompous about itself as time runs along. But right now, I would deeply recommend people around the world to get engaged in burners and hackers things, because that's exactly you can experience these high mind.
What you just described, like the fact that it collapses, that's something I've been focusing on pretty strongly, because I also saw it with the Drupal ecosystem. I saw how you can actually cultivate an information commons and then how it actually leads to the tragedy of the commons. So how that process is happening. So for me, purely visually, it's like bubbles bursting all the time. So they grow, but they're not grounded enough, and then it bursts. So it's.
I think it also has to do with, I think the different archetypes, different types of people are attracted at these phenomena at different stages. So the people that I call the shamanoid characters, the most experimental characters, the wildest, the biggest risk takers, always get involved in these things at the beginning. And that's where you and I come into the picture, and we love it so much. The problem though is that as these things scale up, you get a lot of these organization guys move in. And it's true, when something gets bigger, it needs to get organized better.
Yes.
Once it gets organized better and it grows even more, it becomes more stale and more bureaucratic, and it tends to go more boring in that process. And it tends to be more boring people who start to take over, and they compensate for the lack of schmaltz and creativity. They compensate for the sexiness instead by being much more formal, strict, and they go political.
I wouldn't say boring, because again, Alexander, remember that I'm doing this as an applied scientist, right? So I'm watching how that process evolves all the time. So at the moment, I'm back I'm actually at the moment doing 2 participation research. One is with the sociocratic community. I've understood that many of this new way of working people, so that's the coaching environments, are now using this creative commons called Sociocracy 3.0 to actually do their change management. So there's a community emerging around that. And lately, I'm also a lot working on Clubhouse to understand that new kind of medium. It's something between podcasts and social media. So there's
and it's about to implode in the next 6 months, but it's got to be
probably. That's why I need to be in it quickly to.
Can you imagine the U.S. court cases that we involved in Clubhouse?
Oh, incredible!
2021.
Oh, I mean, I've been in rooms and I've.
But it's fascinating. It is a sort of anarchy of the privileged.
Yes, but you see the whole wave happening like on lightning speed. I already see people like going to the psychological unsafetyness with it, like people really getting psychological sick of it, which is very fast.
Yeah.
But the thing is, as a system engineer, how can we actually learn from those experiences to start being more creative and molding it in a way that it becomes more sustainable? So if you talked about earlier about tribal auto-poiesis, I think it's a very useful term for describing. I think it's a good description of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah,
probably I haven't used the word.
Then the big enemy that always returns both in tech and people's behavior these days is naivety.
Yeah, sure.
So anybody who's looked at Clubhouse and has any kind of experience with people and with technology will know that this will go down in flames within 6 months. This is just not censored and moderated enough to actually work in the long run. And the problem here is that you've got to have a certain set of rules from the very beginning. You've got to be very, very adamant about those rules and uncompromising. Burning Man, for example, operates according to 10 principles.
Okay.
You do not compromise on those 10 principles. And maybe you're a bit tolerant, allow people to experiment and bend them a bit. But 3 or 4 years, every 3 or 4 years, Burning Man headquarters San Francisco goes in and says, boom, we throw this camp and this camp and this camp and this camp and this camp out of the burner community because you broke too many of the rules. Okay. So yeah, and you go back to the 10 principles and they work really, really well. And there's no controversy in the community about it because everybody signed up to those 10 principles. And do you know what they are, why they're there, right? And with anything that starts, we just got to let people talk freely to each other. And here are the groups where they can talk freely to each other and share whatever they like. And it's not recorded, so they can speak more freely than they would if they actually were recorded. The problem with those communities, of course, that you're going to have a lot of backstabbing going on, a lot of bitterness coming up, especially after 20 years of the internet, where people were promised they will all be discovered, they all become stars, and hardly any one of them were.
Yeah, sure. Because
it became a winners takes all. And now Clubhouse comes along and again promises the same thing, that this is your chance to be in the limelight. And the way people are now coming into the limelight is not through hard work. It's not even through celebrity. It's through basically being great backstabbers. That's how it's designed. It's got to be interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, but the only way I can know is if I participate. So that's the thing I'm doing. I want to feel and see.
Or you sign up, as I do, as a psychoanalyst, and get the people to become patients and come through the office and then tell you what horrible has become for them.
Oh yeah, I would
Yeah,
love
because
to.
then you get several viewpoints, except you're just your own one. It's just a tip, you know. Sometimes you don't need to watch the movie to actually understand what the movie is about.
Okay, but you know what? I actually had when I had my shamanic initiation,
Yeah.
I got actually locked up into closed asylum. So I've been able to witness deep psychology very close-handed, and I've learned so much in those few days about depth psychology. So I follow you fully, and I'm actually trying to collaborate with a clinical psychiatrist to bring it to the next level, because if they want it or not, this mass psychology is coming on the next train.
We wrote a book called Digital Libido about it, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think it's a golden age for anthropology.
Well, that's exactly. Yeah. But
because anthropology is really the proper word for social psychology, and anthropology is finally becoming a natural science in the sense that we have data now. We do data all the time, and the great thing with collecting data about everything, we can finally stop guessing and actually prove and test hypotheses about human behavior.
That's a great point to talk about interversity. That's so I've actually been I mentioned that now for 20 years I've been involved in that project. It started as a student in during the .com, when there was this what is called Deep Future Institute in Brussels. There were eventually 130 people, and they were doing things like augmented reality, quantum computing, nanotechnology, call it as crazy as it could be. And then when that system collapsed, the CTO became guest professor at my university at the moment that I'm actually finishing my my master degree. So we had a first year that we reflected on all the projects that were happening there. And then a second year, it's the start of my research on high level cognition. So understanding how we could start working on that. But the thing that I've noticed is that this structure is trying to boot itself up all the time. So it was independent of the .com was a good environment where it tried to self-organize. But then after the Arabic Spring, there was again this momentum that it tried to exist. And it's fitting with what I call the animated worldview now. So basically the interversity, because I can imagine.
I was just going to say, you got to explain both with interversities, and then you got to explain your thesis on the alienated world.
Okay.
Go.
So first of all, the interversity, it's a wicked problem to imagine what you don't know, right? So metaphors help. So just think about information before the internet, how it was locked up in books in libraries. Very static, you had to do a lot of stuff to get there and so on. Today, information is digitally alive in the cloud, connected to sensory stuff and machine learning stuff. So it's really alive, basically. So
we call these two things informationalism and sensocracy in our work.
Okay, I'll check it out later.
Yeah.
So that's the metaphor, like see how information became digital. And now try to imagine how science and technology, R&D, is locked up in labs in universities. It's the same static, unliving structure. And with all the Internet of Things connecting it everywhere, and people just creating code to actually run experiments more than actually doing the field digging work they had to do. So you actually see how R&D is going digital. And so if the last chapter of my PhD, when I zoomed out and asked myself, like, I've done those participation research, I've been playing with this peer learn, what's the bigger picture here? We came up with this concept of interversity, like the next layer of the internet, where the R&D, now it's about information, then it's going to be about creation. It's about how creation itself is starting to boot up its own ability to be alive, which is
this is what we call protopianism in our work. So I'm paralleling it. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's great, but I'm gonna check it out.
It's just vocabularies that need to be matched.
Yeah, I know.
So people who followed me or followed you beforehand, now they can get that we actually work with the same concepts.
That's great. And I've been looking at your videos to prepare for this. So Seeing there's a lot of stuff to learn. So that's the idea of the Interversity. I'm saying that I've just had a chance to be a witness, but thing is emerging. It's with or without me. I really hope I can play an active role, but it really depends on my friends and networks that will be able to give the structure so I can function as a system engineer in it, right? So that's the Interversity. I'm actually writing a book on it. I'm looking for people to collaborate on it to make that more concrete. So that's
it's quite logical, easy in a way, in the sense that at least for the foreseeable future, the great thing to do with AI would be to basically hire AI to do a lot of scientific groundwork for you. But as a human, you'd be involved in the sort of creative, what we call pathical process, where you as human would do what humans do really well. The machine would do what the machine would do really well. And suddenly, you know, for example, if you study law, it's quite obvious because you hire a lot of law assistants and they go through all the books. So they live in a sort of library-oriented environment where there are tons of books and books of law. You need to go through those and find the exact paragraph. You have to go to court cases that set the standards and everything to expect what the outcome would be from investing a certain amount of time and money in a court case. But these things can easily be automated when you realize that if AI could just read all the law books that are relevant and then put them in a hierarchy, like this book is more important than that book or whatever, which AI can easily do, then a lot of young lawyers will be fired, most of them women, by the way, and AI would move into a typical white collar career. And you would have law firms that would beat the shit out of the old law firms because they would run at much lower cost because they're much more AI involved in their work, but they would also do better work. And it's precisely when you see the quality of the work being, well, then encryption comes along as well, and we don't need law any longer, but that's another stuff. But you know, when the quality of the work comes out at the other end at a lower cost and also better prepared for the future, because it's not just that the more digital law firm will beat the shit out the most traditional law firm, it's also the digital law firm is also better prepared to growing in scale towards the future. And since AI will not care about languages, will easily translate everything, and law books are usually national, to some extent international, even to some extent local, then AI can press through all the different books, put them into different hierarchies, and know all the laws of the world. So you can basically go and ask the AI, could you do groundwork here for a certain court case we're going into, where actually could pay off to move it all to New Zealand or move it all to Delaware and settle the court case there? Or move it to digital space to some encryption service that has no territorial address at all. Once you do this, once you figure out any 19-year-old can understand what you're saying in 10 minutes. We describe it that way. But I would say that that's exactly what you're talking about. For me, the Interversity is then the death of academics as we know it, because it's finally going back to deep studies, proper research, and development, right?
Yeah, but what you see is that libraries didn't go extinct. They got back to a smaller, more comfortable size. And I think that's kind of
libraries became museums.
Yeah, well, or meeting places.
Well, yeah,
that's what
museums are. Cafes are always. Museums always pretend that welcome to 1950s America. You want a burger, fries with your Coke. Every museums, that's what they are, right?
Isn't that the normal evolution? Churches used to be a place of political power, and now they are museums.
Yeah. No, we call them paradigm shifts for sure. And the best way to do a world history, and for people who are familiar with my work with Soda, because this is our foundational thesis for our first book, The Nectar Breath, 21 years ago. We have 4 major paradigm shifts in history. Spoken language makes us different from apes. Written language, and that develops over a certain period of time in different ways. Had different aspects, but written language radicalizes the world. There are no permanent settlements without written language anywhere on the planet. Okay? After written language, printed language. Now we're in Europe, 1450. Massive revolution. The industrial age, capitalism, and the European conquest of the rest of the planet, and also almost the end of the planet, the end of it. But that is then replaced by the internet age. So we have dated back exactly and firmly put at 1982. All of the cybernetic revolution that started 50 years earlier actually is part of it too. But it leads into the internet age. And we can then prove, for example, in our work that from 2012, attentionalism overtook capitalism as the driving force of the world economy, meaning that having access to your eyeballs and having access to your ears is now more important than actually putting a good product out there at a good price, because that's not enough any longer. Because if you don't get the attention towards that product itself, you're not even in the market any longer.
Yeah, I follow.
And this, for example, when search algorithms took over and ads are actually dying. Since then, we're now seeing the screaming dying death of marketing and advertising. I call it the third fundamentalism that we got in the West today. We had Christian fundamentalism, then with Islamic fundamentalism, now with capitalist fundamentalism. And its last screaming supernova fundamentalist versus the one to blow you up and kill you is called woke. And it was invented by marketing departments of desperate companies.
Okay, I can't talk about it.
Nobody wants to buy a product anymore. Let's pretend we're good people and we're someone. No, you're a fucking company. Nobody follows a company on Twitter and Instagram. Can somebody please tell the companies?
Sure, and that's what you see. People themselves.
Lil Nas X, a gay black rapper in America, is incredibly funny. Went up against Nike yesterday, and he's winning.
Yeah,
of
but that's
course,
because
David beats Goliath all over again. How dare Nike go against Lil Nas X? It's the death of Nike. Even that.
But McLuhan saying the medium is a message, right?
It's McLuhan. All of this is McLuhan.
Yes, but
all you guys out there, if you haven't read Marshall McLuhan, read Marshall McLuhan.
And now it's people who are the medium.
Yes.
So we are almost getting to the fixed point, and that's maybe what
I think you and I agree that it was bound. When the internet age started,
yes,
already in the 1980s, when I realized that everything would be connected into one giant computer, you could take two distinctions out of that. With the satellites that we put into space were much more important than going to Mars or going.
We talked about Daniel.
The satellites actually connect the world, and that means the satellites are a great metaphor for understanding what's actually happening. There's a whole way.
Yes, because it's regarding. Yeah, we are getting into this internalization.
Yeah, of course, that network itself will have some kind of brain, here a global brain, sooner or later. And the question was, what kind of machinic brain will that system have? And how do we relate to it?
But it's what I like because I focus on this concept of global brain embodiment. Global brain is, so if you look at, first of all, the global brain is the idea, the metaphor that people fire information back and forth, like our neurons are firing information back and forth. And the question
you and I never get stuck with biological intelligence or with technological intelligence. No. We're always in the realm of symbiotic intelligence.
Yes, sure.
We're always in the realm of optimization of man-machine relationships. That's what we are constantly.
Because we are interfaces. That's the essence. If you get to a fixed point, you get to that interface concept, and it's like individuation between the unconscious and the conscious part. That's also an interface all the time. So, and that brings me to the concept, that's the last chapter I want to write in my book on Interversity. So I'll quickly, there are 5 chapters in the book of Interversity. The first 3 relate to the 3 pillars of the classical university. I already demonstrated how it works for education. I'm writing it down how it works with research, and that's happening in the digital jungle. And then there is the third one, which is the public service. So that relates to the tragedy of the commons. But then there are 2 more chapters. The 4th chapter is about grassrooting, is about the fact, the emergence, the tribal auto-poiesis. It's about the fact that this is happening with or without us. It's evolution. It's a cosmic evolutionary game. We are basically, humanity is even redundant in this game. So it's happening with or without us. But that's the grassrooting. I will show how all the different things emerging are leading up
where would the public service thing be in all of this? Because public service was added to academics quite late, and it was added when sort of states, governments started to interfere with academics, as academics as an assistant to the state rather than its opponent. So they didn't want the academic system to become competition for power. No. In the imaginary power, like kings, monarchs, later politicians, like that we call imaginary power. They did not want the symbolic power, which was churches and academics. They didn't want that to interfere with imaginary power. In Europe, we call it separation of church and state. And with the state went the market, and with the church went, the idea that you have a sphere of ideas, a new sphere and discussions and dialogue, whatever. And these spheres were separated. And when the public service aspect was added to academics, that we need to serve the public good, that's I would say it's just a power game that politics played with academics. I see academics as like anything. Academics is either the accumulation of history up until now. which is groundwork in research and education itself.
Maybe that's something for a separate debate then, because I actually see that there's this. So based on what I've seen with the observations with a collapse of a digital ecosystem, I've noticed also like the metaphor I'm trying to explain is it's a small village that's been capable of creating its own crops, the digital tribe. And it's very useful. And then there's like this big empire next to it who hears about it, and they send their army and grab it, and they kill everyone in the village, basically. That's a little bit the metaphor I'm trying to use, is the thing that's happening in a digital world, where there are you talked about naivety. There are many of these nice open source projects and good intentions and wanting to change the world, and they are cultivating a new kind of commons all the time. And every time that little flower blooms, there's the bully taking over. So there is the collapse of the tragedy of the commons happening all the time. But that's because history is a very old dinosaur that's very hungry and all the time trying to get us and eat us young.
No, I think it's naivety of the construction of the commons in the first place. I would say if you learned one thing from the last 30 years, it is that these things do fall apart all the time. So it's about time to learn how to make them work. Okay. Yes. The thing to do, I think, is to very clearly define which is the platform, which is the shared commons. And how is each participant in that platform allowed to, on that platform, build something for their own self-interest? So how do you introduce a local, smaller tribe? For example, how do you start your own tech startup based on a shared platform? What we then discover is that, and even large corporations like IBM and Microsoft have completely, they've embraced this ideology because they actually thrive on it today, is that it's great for a system to distribute value as widely as possible for everybody to have access to, because it creates standards for everybody to operate from. It creates shared wealth. It optimizes the overall wealth and the overall, accumulation of resources in the system. So the great thing to do is basically to set as many shared standards as we possibly can and stretch them as far as we can. But once we've done that, we have to put at a certain point that this is where you're allowed to actually, because people have bills to pay, right? And it's like I always say, don't mix up the church with the company. And the company is different from the church. What you do when you, for example, you're a hacker or you're a burner, and you go deeply into this culture and you love it because you make friends forever, you're popular, and you create these things, and then somebody comes along and a bully comes along and steals it from you. Yeah, because the system itself wasn't built in the proper way from the very beginning. Exactly. Because then it would have been impossible for the bully to even enter the field. Exactly. To be there. Exactly. And that's exactly as soon as you have a shared culture, say a communist culture, say there's a communism here, sort of digital communism in practice. Yep. As soon as you have that there, and you allow for smaller units to actually profit from it in their own way by specializing and doing their own things and, creating patents or whatever you want to do, then the whole system becomes more sustainable and it's less likely to be taken over. You can even go back and study the construction of villages along the rivers of Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. And you will then discover the first scriptures that were written on how do you protect the village from outside nomads storming in, taking everything away from us. So this has been a question that's 5,000 years old. It's fundamental to civilization, which is also why we have a good ethical case. And we're saying, if you can create these systems of voluntary communism, well, the voluntary communism goes for as long as possible, and we press it for as long as possible, without being so naive as we don't think that we need to put within that system some sort of smaller, what we then call capitalist units, right? Yeah. And I think otherwise you create a very naive atmosphere. Exactly. Say, for example, Pirate Bay. They were dead fun.
What, sorry?
Pirate Bay.
Oh, yeah, Pirate Bay. Okay, yeah.
This is the early 2000s for the kids who are too young to get it. Okay. File sharing exploded. I was one of the few music company directors in Europe who enjoyed it, although I saw my own business go down the drains in the process. But I also knew there must be other businesses around the corner. That's why I loved Spotify when they came along. But Spotify was a typical example of somebody smart enough to create a better service than Pirate Bay in terms of customer experience. The people were willing to pay $10 for a month because it was better than file sharing, not because the people cared about the law or anything. But people moved there. But the real genius of Spotify was that they employed a lot of Pirate Bay developers and gave them a proper job. And they didn't even tell that story, interesting enough, because that's the story that really a lot of people would have loved to hear, would have given them even better credibility, because it was real. It's just like, okay, we're moving to a commercial realm, for God's sake, but we're going to have 18 million songs safely downloaded in a second. You don't have to keep your own hard drive any longer to keep the songs. So we'll give you a better service, and we'll employ these guys and finally pay the guys to do all the hard work of putting the files out there, which is a recognition of that file sharing was work.
Yeah.
So, but
and it's
from a communist perspective, it was disastrous, because the communist project was, of course, not Spotify, valued at what, $50 billion or whatever. The communist project here was Pirate Bay.
Yeah.
So I think we have to live with that dialectic.
Yes, but the question is, if we can examine it better, can we create architectural structure for it?
Yes, I think we can. I think you also need to understand that the guys who walk through the door and want to be the good guys to save the world are always the problem later on.
Sure.
You know, I've learned that the hard way for years working with these things. But the guy who comes in through the door and wants to impress his mother by being the good guy, because if you want to be the good guy, you've already automatically assumed there must be an evil guy out there that you're going to go up against. And that evil guy you go up against is probably not evil at all. He's just a competitor, right? So it's better to be brutally honest from the very beginning and say, for example, if you're going to be a communist in a digital realm, it's better to say that I could easily be a capitalist. I definitely understand the payoffs. I wouldn't mind the money, and I wouldn't mind the Lamborghinis, and recognize and be honest about it, because only that honest personal journey you make can then say, but I could actually also say no to that for having the creative freedom in return to create something that's actually shared. And the perfect example, it's not perfect, but the perfect example says that it's big and obvious to the 90 years, just to mention Wikipedia.
Yeah.
So anybody says that, I'm against communism, well, you use Wikipedia every day, don't you? Piggybacking on communism, you know? It's just that's how these things work. And I think it's an ongoing, really fruitful philosophical activist debate that we need.
You're asking for maturity, yeah? You're asking them to stop being childish and take it up as a grown-up. And I like that.
Yeah, because we could afford to be infantile about the internet in the 1990s. We only destroyed capitalist money when the dot-com companies went down the drain. Yeah. And after that came a lot of these really fruitful, fantastic things in the early 2000s with, file sharing and everything. And now we all got used to that we're online 8 hours a day, and we want to be in control of what we do online, but we're willing to share power with other people. Mm-hmm. I think actually Marx was wrong. I don't think we could go from capitalism to socialism to communism. I think socialism is bound to be a dead end, proven by the Soviet Union. But I think capitalism through potentialism to communism is a possibility.
Well, you're talking to someone Europe is pretty social.
Yeah, but it's got stuck. It's the least creative continent in the world at the moment, to be honest about it.
But the thing is, I like the fact that at a certain moment, you're grown up enough to have your own evolution in your hands, and you can actually navigate to the future. That's okay. But then you have still this problem of these paradoxes, and you don't know how to deal with the paradoxes. And the thing that you need to do then is actually nudge it up a level and go to understanding the world on yet a more abstract level.
You are very Hegelian here, Mixel.
Maybe,
but yes, you will love Hegel when you dig into it, but you're very Hegelian here. Go on.
But that's what I see. I mean, now I know that every paradox I know is an opportunity. It's a gift, because the paradox shows me where I can really fundamentally grow my understanding. And now, talking about Europe, there's a very clear called European paradox. The European paradox is that from a scientific output, we are really, really doing well. But from capitalizing on that output, we are like terrible. So that's the paradox. Like, how come we have all these bright ideas and never capable of turning them into something that brings food on the table? So there's that's a paradox.
It's even called the Pfizer Biontech paradox these days.
Yeah.
Because Biontech is a Turkish company in Germany that had developed the most powerful vaccine against COVID-19 in the world. Okay. Owned by a huge American corporation called Pfizer, which is a Wall Street.
It's credible how
It's a
that all
perfect
is
example we
connected.
just described.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It's true.
So you want me to talk a bit about the animated worldview as well, or
yes, please do. And then we got to finish off this conversation. I'd love to have another one, Mixel. I think
yeah,
it's
sure.
fantastic.
So just like during my PhD, the Interversity was the last chapter to wrap up and take a step back and say, what is this? So now I'm really trying to basically, I want to write that book on Interversity to get rid of it because I want to finish it. I want to put my hands out of it. And the last part is what I called the animated worldview. So what I've noticed is that in the 1890s, there's a paradigm shift in science happening, and you actually see the foundations for the thing that led to the computer there too. That's related to Hilbert's problem. But the guy I really love is Henri Poincaré, who looked at astrology and solved a very tough physics problem called the three-body problem by creating a fixed point mathematics. And that changes everything. And so while that kind of thinking more, so they start calling it chaos theory, which is a terrible word for what's really happening. Complex adaptive system thinking.
If there was a genuine chaos, you cannot have a theory on it.
Yeah. And the same is with quantum physics. I mean, the word is actually giving a bad name to the thing it is. And so what I'm getting at is that if you look at, you mentioned earlier the satellites, right? Looking at so we are going out space to actually look back in. And that's a little bit.
The satellites finally become God's eye that we've been waiting for God to look at us. And it turns out that we're actually the God sitting behind the satellites looking at ourselves. Yeah.
And that's the thing what you're mentioning, like we're becoming God's eye, like the earth is becoming this giant eyeball. But the thing is we can start looking outside as astronauts, or we can start looking inside like psychonauts, right?
Yeah, there's a lot more going on here inside.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the metaphor I'm using is like if we started really playing with light and lenses, we were capable of making visible a macro world and a micro world that was invisible for us, because bacteria, we couldn't see them. And galaxies, we couldn't see them. They were just one light dot. They didn't look different than stars. So once we are capable of playing with that lenses, there suddenly are different cosmoses opening up. And what I'm saying is that we actually have this hidden in plain sight. We have another cosmos. And that's,
I think it's all about scales.
Yeah, but
I know even Nassim Taleb, and it's a good popularizer of great ideas. His new book has got to be about scales, but I've always been fascinated with the scales, and this is about scales.
Well,
and the scales being accessible here.
I actually think that cyberspace is a real cosmic virtual cosmos. And the computers we have that actually are teaching us how to be more mature with recursion are actually like the lenses of the microscope and telescope, but they are like lenses for what I like to call a virtue scope. And when you were earlier talking about basically about the law going digital, for me that fits perfectly with this concept of a virtue scope, because we are if law itself starts creating this positive feedback loop that it creates its own autonomy, creates its own agency. That's the thing that feedback loops do. They create their own agency. But what is an agency more than what we are? So the thing is that I'm seeing everywhere around me now, I see this spirit kind of feedback structure that have their own autonomy, their own entity, their own willingness to exist.
Oh, yeah. I mean, once you've got standards in place, you can have these institutions that make decisions that are difficult for you to make when they need to be made. You know, for example, central banks these days are not run by politicians any longer. And that's why the politicians kept moving us into inflationary periods any longer as well, which is good, you know, for the economy overall. You just make them independent and you know how they operate. You know, the central banks have more data than you have. That's exactly why you can be a bit surprised when the rates go up and down, but it's just because they have more data than you have, because actually central banks are run more or less like machines. They can easily be run by AI very soon. And then they have an agency,
sure.
But it's actually an agency that is simply reflective of its surrounding world.
Mm-hmm. And so, but the thing that I'm seeing is that people are not aware that the world is behaving this way. If once you have kind of a recursion happening, the thing can have its own life. So be careful where you put your recursions, because before you know it, first we make our tools and then the tools make us, right? So what the hell are we creating here? And so that's the idea of the animated worldview, is that, and it's a very natural bringing the whole spiritual and all psychedelical stuff back into actually as an advancement of science. Because what I see is that we switched from doing science on paper and creating models and doing all the descriptions ourselves to the science becoming animations. And the oldest we have is weather forecasts, where if you look at the weather forecasting models, we use them to perceive more than we do to black box it or to fix it. And so the thing that I've noticed, that's the start of my PG basically. The thing that I've noticed is that I was playing for higher level of cognition. I was playing with something that worked in a static environment, say machine learning, right? And was questioning how will that happen in a complex adaptive environment. And the same thing happened in many domains where people were looking at something that worked pretty well when the frame they were working in would stay the same. Yes. But if that frame started changing very rapidly, they would always come back to that same system of creation. And that's why I done that.
That's why we need to kill Plato once and for all, because of Plato goes out through the door. Really? We're moving to to multi-dynamical systems. That's when Plato goes out the door, because the forms become completely irrelevant.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So that's why we in our philosophy work with processes all the time. And then in addition to process, there is the possibility for the event. Gilles Deleuze did formidable work in this department. Hegel certainly before him, and certainly Nietzsche as well. These are the greatest Western thinkers of process and event. And there has been a lot of thought being given to process and event in Indian, Chinese, Korean, Japanese philosophy too. So that's what we do in our work. We got to have more conversations, Mixel. This was fantastic.
Definitely, this was fun. Yeah, I've enjoyed a lot. I mean,
yeah. And if somebody else wants to get engaged with the conversations, we'll record them and put them out there. Then they're welcome to join us as well. Sure. The Intellectual Deep Web is around. You find at least me on Facebook. Get in contact with me if you're interested in joining. That's all there's to it.
Okay.
Easy that.
Thanks a lot. This was fun.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm going to go into my next Zoom. So are you probably. And speak real soon.
Speak real soon. This was fun.
Big love.
Bye. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Ayahuasca.